Good evening. Welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Joel Westfall, and it is my honor to serve here as the Deputy Director of both the library and the museum, and to welcome you on behalf of the Archivist of the United States. And we're very pleased to have you with us for tonight's important program. This evening's program is brought to you by the National Archives and Records Administration with additional support from the Ford Foundation. We are grateful to all of you who are members of Friends of Ford and contributors to the foundation. I have Mr. Joe Calvaruso here tonight, Executive Director of the Ford Foundation, so thank you very much, Joe. It is your ongoing support that makes possible our feature exhibits, research travel grants, educational activities, and public programs just like this one. Before we get started, I have to do the obligatory please silence your phones and other electronic devices. Thank you very much. Also, before we begin, as many of you know where I've come from, I worked at the Pentagon, worked at U.S. Central Command as a DoD civilian, and I take this as kind of a sacred duty that I do this, especially this week. I would like, please, any of you who are a veteran of our armed forces to please stand up. Thank you very much. Thank you. Prior to introducing our speaker, I'd like to provide you with some information about our upcoming programs and exhibits coming to both of our locations. Over in Ann Arbor, we have our Christmas quilt being set up. The lobby will be adorned with Christmas quilts, but they're a little different because they're kind of a mix of modern designs and traditional designs. So it's a little eclectic and a little different. We hope you enjoy it if you can get across the state. Also, although many of you, I'm sure, are very fond of the Kennerly exhibit upstairs in the temporary gallery, the Kennerly exhibit is, part of it, I should say, is moving to Ann Arbor, where that will reside there, and it will be moving out of the museum. And I'll be telling you what it's going to be replaced by soon. Before I do that, on Sunday, December 1st, Santa and his reindeer will be visiting the museum from 1 to 4 p.m. Along with Santa, there will be holiday music and, of course, the former Brenton Village train on display. And that December 1st is a free event, and the museum is free for that event. On Thursday, December 12th, at 7 p.m., our next speaker, Mary Evans Seeley, will share stories of Christmases, both past and present, at the White House. This event will most likely will probably be live streamed, so pay attention if you can't make it here for that particular event. Again, I'm very pleased to announce, which will be replacing the Kennerly exhibit upstairs, is the former Brenton Village train in a large Christmas holiday display. The train opens to the public on December 1st and will be on exhibit through January 5th, 2020. As a special gift to the city of Grand Rapids, again, thank you very much for Joe Calvaruso and the foundation that supports these wonderful events, is that we will be free, totally free for the kids so they can enjoy that train from Christmas, for their Christmas break. From December 23rd until January 5th, we hope that you can bring your grandchildren or children to come to the museum and take advantage of the free museum and take advantage of the free train. On exhibit, once the train is done, on exhibit beginning in February 2020, we will be hosting The Continual Struggle. This is an exhibit from Brian Washington, whose ongoing body of work documenting the civil rights movement and America's historical struggle against segregation and other forms of race-based disenfranchisement. The Continual Struggle employs visual art as a means of storytelling, vividly recalling a time when people were willing to go into the streets to protest injustice and inequality. And so watch again for more details about that exhibit coming up. Handouts are also available outside for many of these programs. So now on for tonight's program and tonight's speaker. So, our original plan was to have Mr. Carlin here about 10 months ago. And that kind of fell through because there was that government shutdown thing that happened. And we had a plan for him to be here, and unfortunately that kind of interrupted the issue. interrupted, so I'm very happy to say, John, we're better late than never. John Carlin is here tonight to discuss his book, Dawn of the Cold War, America's Battle Against Russia, China, and the Rising Global Cyber Threat. Mr. Carlin, as a career official as well as a political appointee, has served both Republican and Democratic administrations in senior management positions, most recently as the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, the DOJ's highest national security lawyer. Prior to assuming his role at NSD, Mr. Carlin served as the Chief of Staff and Senior Counsel to Robert Mueller, former Director of the FBI, where he helped lead the FBI's evolution to meet growing and changing national security threats, including cyber threats. Mr. Carlin also held positions as the National Coordinator of the DOJ's Computer Hacking and Intellectual Property Program and Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, where he prosecuted cyber fraud and public corruption matters, as well as trying over 40 cases. Mr. Carlin now works in the private sector and currently works for Morrison and Foerster. There he chairs the Global Risk and Crisis Management Team and advises industry-leading organization in sensitive cyber and national security matters, white-collar investigations, and government enforcement actions. Mr. Carlin is also an inaugural fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Homeland Security project, focused on the unique challenges and choices around protecting the American homeland. He also chairs the Aspen Institute's Cybersecurity and Technology Policy Program, which provides a cross-disciplinary forum for industry, government, and media to address the rapidly developing landscape of digital threats and craft appropriate policy solutions. He has been featured or cited as a leading authority on cyber and economic espionage matters by numerous major media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, 60 Minutes, Meet the Press, Nightline. I could go on and on. It is my pleasure to welcome John Carlin, finally, to the Ford Presidential Museum.
Thank you for coming out tonight and to the Ford Foundation for their support for this type of program. They promised me that although it had been delayed, it would be a lot warmer this time of year. So I'm just only imagining what it's like here in January. Let me start with, imagine this. Imagine you're at a company and you hear from someone in the information technology department, hey, we got a problem. Someone has hacked into our system and it looks like they've stolen a relatively small amount of personal identifiable information, names, addresses. And they don't look that sophisticated. It wasn't a very complicated hack. Don't worry, we fixed it, we got them out of the system. So you go back to your job. A couple of weeks later, you get another knock on the door and they say, boss, we got a little bit of an issue. We received an email. It's got some spelling mistakes, some grammatical errors, but they seem to be asking for two things. One, they want $500 through Bitcoin, through digital currency. Otherwise, they're going to embarrass us by making public the fact that they hacked into our system and stole this information. Oh, and by the way, number two, they want to be let back onto the system. They're mad that we threw them off. I think every company would agree the latter is a bad idea. They're not going to let them back onto the system. But the vast majority of companies today, faced with that scenario, think, hey, we're feeling pretty good. If the guy was that great a hacker, he wouldn't need our help to get back on the system. And they either pay the $500 to avoid the embarrassment, they pay the ransom, they pay the extortion, or they decide everyone's getting hacked these days, it's no big deal, we won't pay it, and it won't be that embarrassing if they release it. But what they don't do, the vast majority of companies, is go to government and say that we've had this issue, that we've had this intrusion. Now, this company did. And it's only because they did that they found out that on the other end of that hack was not the low-level hacker that it looked like. It was, in fact, a guy named Farizi, an extremist from Kosovo, who had moved from Kosovo to Malaysia to get better access to broadband, believe it or not. And from Malaysia, working with a co-conspirator in Kosovo, the two of them hacked into this US-based company and stole information from you, from their customers. And he really did want the $500. But on the back end, he also had become friends with one of the most notorious terrorists in the world at the time, a man named Junaid Hussain. Now, Junaid Hussain was a British citizen who had been arrested for computer hacking, and while he was in jail, became radicalized. And when he got out of prison, he moved from the London area to Raqqa, Syria, where he was located at the very heart of the Islamic State. At the time, I was running the National Security Division. The National Security Division is the first new litigating division at the Justice Department in 50 years, since the creation of the Civil Rights Division. And the mission behind our division was clear, that we had failed prior to September 11th in government to share information across the law enforcement and intelligence divide, and that failure to share information and act on it effectively had led to the unnecessary loss of thousands of lives. It was a mistake that couldn't be repeated again. And in addition to the Department of Homeland Security, to the Directorate of National Intelligence, the National Security Division was created with the idea that success could no longer be measured by the prosecution of a terrorist after the fact when families were grieving. But success would be measured by the ability to share information, to think of disruptive strategies, and prevent the attack from occurring in the first place. And during this attack that we've talked about now, Foerster attacking this US company, we were dealing with more international terrorism cases than we ever had in our country. So between 2014 and 2016, we brought over 100 terrorism cases all throughout the country. We had open investigations in every FBI field office. And what we were finding was that there was a new terrorist threat. As we had gotten better post 9/11 at sharing information, we became very good at disrupting what I'll call the traditional Al-Qaeda threat. Al-Qaeda looked to train and vet operatives. They would bring them from the United States or elsewhere to the Fatah region, to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and from that region, they would try to deploy them to commit complex attacks on the scale of September 11th. These cells were tightly commanded and controlled. They had close operational scrutiny of what they did. And we got very good at picking up on that intelligence, working with allies throughout the world to disrupt them where they were. We used all tools of government power, the intelligence community, the military, law enforcement, the State Department, our diplomatic allies. As we got better at disrupting terrorism 1.0, though, we saw them get better. And what we saw with first in the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but then with the Islamic State, is just like Al-Qaeda had used Western technology that does much good around the world, in that case aviation, and turned a plane into a weapon of mass destruction, we watched as the Islamic State took another Western innovation, this time social media, the ability to communicate instantaneously from anywhere in the world with people inside the United States, and they took advantage of social media in order to do crowdsourcing of terrorism. And that was terrorism 2.0, where they bombard messages. They didn't care so much whether the adherents were closely trained or vetted. They tried to turn human beings into weapons. And they particularly targeted young people and troubled people. What we didn't find in the United States, unlike some of even our closest allies, we didn't find it was one particular ethnic group. We didn't find it was in a particular geographic area. We didn't even find these people who wanted to go kill in the name of a religion that they were particularly religious. They couldn't tell the difference between some of the core Muslim ideology. They couldn't tell the difference between Sunni and Shia. But what we did find were two trends. Number one, in almost every case that we brought, the defendants were young. In over 60% of the cases, they were 25 or younger. And in one-third of the international terrorism cases, the defendants were 21 or younger. And that's simply never been true before when it came to international terrorism. In fact, it's so rare in the federal system, we had to issue new guidance to every U.S. Attorney's Office across the country on how to handle juveniles in the federal system. And linked to that phenomenon was the second trend, which is in almost every single case, there was a social media involvement. So this crowdsourcing of terrorism was working. I say that to you because Junaid Hussain, the British citizen who's now moved to Raqqa, Syria, he was at the tip of the spear of the Islamic State's campaign of using social media to try to convince people to kill where they lived. And Junaid Hussain befriends Foerster, the Kosovo extremist living in Malaysia who's hacked into a US company and stole your customer information. He befriends him, although they never met in the real world. They only met through social media. They met through Twitter, and they started direct messaging. And Junaid Hussain convinces Foerster to give him that information that he stole, trying to make 500 bucks. And when Junaid Hussain gets the message, he could care less about the 500 bucks. What he wants to do is what the Islamic State was doing then. This was a group that was taking women and children into slavery, that was using rape as a political tool, that was killing Muslims and non-Muslims alike with impunity. And so what he wanted to do with that stolen information was use it to create a kill list. So he looked through the stolen information to see who looks like they have a .mil email address or a .gov, who might be a government employee, and he curated a kill list. And then using Twitter, he pushed that kill list back to the United States and said, kill these people by name, by address, where they live, using the information entrusted to a private company. So think about that. The complexity of it. It's five, 6 different countries. It's moving at the speed and scale of cyber. And most importantly, when I talk about those reforms that were made, the billions of dollars of investment, the new departments, the division that I led, all created post-September 11th, they were all focused on sharing information within and between governments. But to address our new challenge, what not just 1 or 2 or 3, but at this point, the current acting director of national intelligence is the 4th head of our intelligence community to say that the top threat to our country is attack through cyber means. And one of the reasons why is to succeed against this new threat requires not sharing information within and between governments, but figuring out how to share that information at speed and scale to the private sector that's receiving these attacks, and how to get information back from the private sector at the speed and scale that you need to stop this threat. In this case, again, they did work with the government. That's why I can share so many of these details with you today. Because thanks to their cooperation, we were able to work with the State Department to get cooperation from the Malaysians. The Malaysians arrested Foerster pursuant to our criminal process. He was extradited to the United States. He was pled guilty in Virginia, and he's serving 20 years in prison. Junaid Hussain was outside even the long reach of US law enforcement, and he was killed in an openly acknowledged military strike by Central Command. And actually, after he was killed in those military strikes, along with several of his cadre, we saw, I can't say 100% it was causal, but we saw for the first time a marked decrease in the number of international terrorism cases we had to bring inside the United States. And although it was great tactical success to bring some of those cases, in one case, there was an instance, thanks to good work by the intelligence community, of an individual who didn't want to wait anymore for a plot to kill coming from the Islamic State, so he grabbed a long knife and tried to get onto a bus in Boston, where he was shot by an FBI agent before he was able to board the bus and kill. So these were nick-of-time prevention, tactical success, but it was failure, strategic failure long-term, as long as this terrorist group was so successful at getting kids, at getting defendants 21 and younger to try to commit these attacks. And we didn't see that decrease, again, until those strikes. When you think about the success of the Islamic State, which rested so much on social media, some people, you think about their most horrific videos. So they put out videos of someone being burned alive. They put out videos of someone slowly being beheaded. And I know I've gotten a lot of questions from people like, who looks at that video and decides that's the group for me? Why was that successful? And the fact is it wasn't. So those videos were used for people who already believed in the Islamic State or to scare their enemies. When they were recruiting, they actually were quite sophisticated, and they used their expertise on social media, and Junaid Hussain in particular, to micro-target certain demographics. So in the United States, what we would see were videos that were produced where there'd be a handsome young terrorist in soft focus lens with the Islamic State branded in the corner, just like you'd see on a normal advertisement. And it would show things like the terrorist handing out cotton candy to happy children in the Levant. They'd say, come to the Levant, live with us over here, and this is what life will be like. And when I say they were micro-targeting demographics, when I went over to meet with my counterpart running Homeland Security in the United Kingdom, they were seeing the same ad in Europe, but there they were showing the terrorists handing out Nutella, because that was the treat that kids liked there. So they were quite sophisticated. And in terms of trying to come up with new tactics or techniques, this was one of the strange things in my career at Justice. Only time we held a meeting and we brought in Madison Avenue advertisers, internet service provider companies, and nonprofit groups to say, we're no good at delivering this message. We're not going to convince troubled kids coming from the government not to join one of these groups. You're the experts on advertising and how to use this media. Let us show you what we're seeing. And this was a time where we were trying to get cooperation from those companies on policing how people were using their own social media. And I remember particularly the advertising companies saying just how slickly produced these ads were. And I'd never heard of micro-targeting demographics before. I'm not in advertising, but that's where I picked out that lingo from them. And in fact, the guy who ran the campaign for Marine recruiting said they were hitting some of the very same themes and going after the very same demographic that Marines were. And they were hitting, this is a different set of ads that were very slickly produced. And they said they really were of the same quality of Madison Avenue. And that's partly because with this change in technology that we have now, we've made it very easy, very affordable, both to have access to the means to produce something that's that slickly produced, and then also for it to reach an audience here. Let me back up a little bit. So when that case came, prior to that case, early in my career, I'd been a prosecutor who prosecuted computer hacking and intellectual property crimes. Actually, the acronym was CHIPS, and it comes from when Director Mueller, before he was director of the FBI, he was the head of a federal prosecutor's office out in Northern California, and he created the first CHIPS unit. And he's not someone that watches a lot of TV, and so he had no idea there was a show called CHIPS where people wore short shorts and sunglasses, and he come up with this name, and the rest of us got a lot of flack for being called the chip prosecutors, for which I still blame him. But when I was doing those cases, I worked with a squad at the FBI, and the folks I was working with there, they did criminal cases, and I did criminal cases, and that's all we did. And in fact, sometimes an agent would switch squads, and they just disappeared when they went to the intelligence side. They went behind a locked, secured, compartmented door, and I never saw them again. I didn't know what they were working on. And even when I went to run nationally our computer hacking program and overseeing all the criminal cases, I still did not know what was going on the intelligence side of the house. And it wasn't until I went over to the FBI to work for the then relatively anonymous Director Mueller, and I think he wishes he could go back to those days. But when I went over to work there, for the first time for me, the door opened, and I could see what was happening on the national security side of the house. In fact, I went to a facility that the FBI ran along with other members of the intelligence community, and there was a giant Jumbotron screen, bigger than the screen behind me here. And on that screen, we could watch in real time, due to great work by the intelligence community, we could watch in real time as nation states, particularly China, hopped into places like universities. They'd go from the university into companies, and then, because they had a graphic user interface, so when I say watch, I really was watching it, we would literally watch billions of dollars worth of intellectual property and trade secrets flow from the United States, hop to points outside of the country, and then land back in China. So, amazing feat to be able to watch it, but I think you'll agree with me, it did not feel like success to watch what the former head of the National Security Agency, Keith Alexander, called the largest transfer of wealth in human history. And I think he was right about that. So when I went back to the National Security Division, one of the things we were working on is how do we change from going from a posture of watching and collecting to disrupting? And there were good reasons why we were watching. So a lot of the culture that had grown up was around espionage and grew out of the Cold War. And there, just like in terrorism with the original Al-Qaeda threat, we were facing an adversary who invested enormous resources into tightly controlled operations inside the United States, and they still do. You know, I was over there, one of the cases we brought was the Russian illegals case, and this was the ring that became the basis for the show The Americans. They were a family put into the United States, and so they left these Russian operatives inside the United States for nearly 20 years, for decades, trying to have them live lives as normal Americans, thinking at some point they could activate them to operate and collect intelligence. And while they were putting the resources into running that ring, we were just watching them. And the idea was, if we knew where the rings were and you don't disrupt, then you can feed false information. They're wasting resources on something that's ultimately not going to be able to collect. And if you disrupt it, they're going to come up with some new way that we might not be able to catch. The problem was, and that screen demonstrated it, is that the threat changed with the new technology. And so just like Al-Qaeda, we moved from terrorism 1.0 to crowdsourcing of terrorism 2.0, where it becomes too big to disrupt. China was hitting every single company. We just weren't learning a lot watching the intelligence, and they were so unworried about being caught. Later director Comey called it like a gorilla in your house, is how noisy they were when they were hacking into systems. And it was true. Companies knew they were being hacked, but there was no deterrence. We didn't do anything after the fact. And it was costing real jobs. It was affecting real companies. So it wasn't just traditional intelligence collection of spy versus spy, where the targets on each side are governmental targets. So I went back to the Justice Department. We started looking at, well, what can we do to disrupt? So one place we started was we opened that door, and we made a new unit, the National Security Cyber Specialist, in every U.S. Attorney's office across the country, with the idea that just like in terrorism, these prosecutors would be trained on computer fraud and abuse and electronic communications, Privacy Act, and how to bring a cyber case, and the bits and the bytes. But on the other hand, they'd be trained on how to handle classified information, how to bring it in a criminal proceeding, and then get read in at the highest clearances, and then briefed on what the threats are, so we could try to come up with disruptive techniques. That change in approach led to the first case of its kind. And this was the indictment of 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, a specialized unit, Unit 61398, that we brought in the spring of 2014. And at the time, it was a bit controversial. China was not happy that we had indicted members of their army. And there was a question is, why are you using the criminal justice system? I think the answer is really in some of the exhibits in that case. So we showed that they were doing things like, right before Westinghouse was going to do a joint venture with a Chinese partner, and they were going to lease a lead pipe, we watched these members of the Chinese military go in and steal the technical design specifications for the pipe. And then the next morning, no surprise, they no longer had to pay to do the lease. Now, it wasn't a military secret, so it was just to make a buck. They were targeting a private company for the benefit of the private company's competitor overseas. Another case similar was another victim that we charged in that case was a U.S. subsidiary of a German multinational. It's called SolarWorld. And what they did there is they hacked into the email system, so the least protected part of the system. It's not intellectual property. They hacked into the email system. They watched the executives write about pricing information. They figured out the price point that would most damage the company, and then they price dumped and did force that company into bankruptcy. And to add insult to injury, when SolarWorld sued for unfair trade practices, they stole the whole litigation strategy. So again, not a national security secret. In fact, there's another different case that we brought, the Liu case, and this was a case where they stole the formula for titanium dioxide from DuPont. And that sounds like it might have some military application, but actually it was the formula for the color white that's used in Oreo cookies. And I do love Oreo cookies, but they are not a national security secret, not something we need to protect. So when I say they were stealing everything, I mean they literally stole the color white. So that's why it was important that we started to take action and make public what we were seeing, and switch from that mentality that had grown up from the Cold War of that default, we kept it secret, and it was something that the government could handle internally, and start moving to a posture of, number one, figuring out who did it, number two, making it public, and number three, imposing consequences. And here the consequence was in the form of a criminal indictment. And when people were arguing about whether you should do it or not, I mean, one of the analogies I use that will be familiar to many of you is the idea that grows from common law of an easement. So this is a concept that grew out of British common law. It's in U.S. law that says if you let someone walk across your lawn long enough, they get the legal right to walk across your lawn. That's the easement. That's why you put up a no trespass sign. And so in some ways, this criminal case was a giant no trespass sign, get off our lawn. When it comes to what's been called sometimes the wild west of cyber, where we're all trying to figure out what the laws or norms are. International law is a law of customary law. You know, the rules developed by the way nations have behaved and what they've said is acceptable or not acceptable. And as long as we were allowing, on this type of scope and scale, a foreign nation state to steal intellectual property and saying that's just normal espionage, we were creating the new law, the new international law or norm that says that's okay. So the idea was this would be the first of many when it came to this type of case, but we were no longer going to sit silently and watch this happen. How many of you know the first destructive attack, cyber attack, that occurred on US soil from a foreign adversary? Any guesses? Heard one person say, so Sony is the one that people usually remember, the attack on Sony Motion Pictures by North Korea. It wasn't, in fact, the first, but it was not something that we were expected, and it got a lot of attention. I can tell you, we war-gamed for years. What would it look like if a rogue nuclear-armed nation decided to attack the United States through cyber means? And we all got it wrong. You know, we thought it would be the electric grid or something, a nuclear plant, but instead it was because of a movie about a pot-smoking journalist called The Interview. And I'll say it's the only time in my career I had to go brief the President of the United States in the Situation Room and start the briefing on a national security matter with a plot summary of a movie. And for those of you who've seen that movie, and I blame North Korea for the fact that I had to see that movie, not my favorite film, although Sony had every right to make it, it's not easy to summarize because the movie doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. It's a silly comedy. Also was a surreal experience because it was right around the Christmas holidays and our normal threat briefing with the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI. We were all watching movie clips to try to figure out what had so agitated North Korea that we had to be there. Now, there actually had been an attack before the North Korean attack that also was destructive. And the difference between the two attacks, Sony's one that people remember, the other attack no one's ever heard of. The other attack was by Iranian-affiliated actors, and it was against the Sands Casino. Again, not what we were expecting, a gambling casino. But what happened there was similarly, Shelley Adelson, the head of the Sands Casino, had said some mildly provocative remarks about Iran, something about turning them into a nuclear dust cloud. The Ayatollah was not amused and issued a fatwa calling for cyber jihad against Shelley Adelson, and shortly thereafter we saw a destructive attack, meaning it was malware that essentially turned computers into bricks. It wiped their operating system. Now in that case, there was someone pretty quick thinking in the information technology department that essentially pulled the plug to keep it from spreading throughout all their facilities through the world, so it had a more limited damage. They fixed it, they went back to business, and it didn't get huge public attention. Fast forward a little bit to the North Korean attack on Sony, and you see certain similarities, but there was a lesson I think that we should have learned better then that I think Russia was watching and used in our 2016 elections. And that is, what North Korea did to Sony were three things. Number one, just like the Iranian actors with Sands, they turned the computers into bricks. So they unleashed malware on their systems. Not what got huge press attention. Number two, they stole intellectual property, just like we'd seen China doing and China was regularly doing. They stole movies, pre-release, and released them. Again, and we've seen multiple of those cases, doesn't resonate. The third thing they did is the thing that caused the most harm to Sony, and it was the easiest thing to do as a hacker. They went in, just like the Chinese had stole pricing information, they went into the email, the least protected part of the system, and they stole communications between the executives that were embarrassing. So just salacious email, gossip talk, and then using non-traditional media, these new WikiLeaks type sites that are set up, they put that information out, and then they watched, ironically, when you had a North Korean dictator trying to impose and prevent our values, the First Amendment values of free speech inside the United States, ironically, they watched the mainstream media pick up the stolen information and write about it, and that's what caused the most damage to Sony. They used the media to effectuate the attack. And that's what you see Russia pick up on and use very similar tradecraft when they attack the Democratic National Committee servers, steal information, use non-traditional media to watch mainstream media do an attack that's really cheap and easy to do if it continues to work that way. Now, when it came to North Korea and Sony, we were figuring out, and people said, well, it is about a movie. Why are you treating it like a national security event? And the fact was, for a while, when we thought about our cybersecurity response, we focused very much on infrastructure, on things, and how to protect them, and thought that those are the national security issues. But the other lesson we should have learned that Russia did is that they weren't attacking a thing, they were attacking our value. So if we didn't respond or treat it as a national security event, it would mean other dictators in other countries throughout the world could threaten this type of cyber attack and chill the ability to have free speech inside the United States and affect what it is that you watch or don't watch. That's why we treated it like a national security event. The what to do about it, we had done the PLA case, so we had done one before, but it was another test of switching to this new model of, okay, we figured out who did it, it's North Korea. Now we need to make it public and impose some type of consequence. And in that case, we realized if it had been a terrorist or someone who proliferated weapons of mass destruction, we had a good authority in place, an executive order where the president could sanction the entities, so cut them off from the US dollar and banking system. But when it came to cyber actors, there was no such executive order. Now, luckily, North Korea had done so many other terrible things that we could just sanction them because we had an existing order unique to North Korea. But it was clear that that wasn't a very good basis overall. And later, in spring of 2015, President Obama, for the first time, signed an executive order that allows not just the sanctioning of those that steal the information, so those uniformed members of the military. And when you go back to that case, by the way, we put an exhibit in that case that showed their activity started around 9 a.m. in the morning. It went from 9 to noon. Then there was a pause. It went down from noon to 1. Apparently they take a lunch break. Went up again from 1 to 6, decreased overnight on weekends and Chinese holidays. So former prosecutor in me would say circumstantial evidence that it's coming from China. But also, if you think about it, that's the second largest military in the world, and their day job, when they put on their uniform in the morning, their 9 to 5 day job is to attack private companies for private gain. And so when people say that companies should protect themselves or blame the victims when there's some type of breach that occurs, it's just not feasible. They don't have the resources. They're never going to be able to protect themselves against a resource that big. It's got to be in partnership with the government. President Obama signed an executive order that said, hey, we're not just going to go after the uniformed members that do the hack, but it allowed us to sanction the companies that were the beneficiaries of the stolen information. And I think that did get China's attention. And President Trump has re-signed that same executive order, so it's in place today. As we start heading towards a major summit between President Obama and President Xi, we had another series of attacks that were going on outside of China, which is Iran. And what we were seeing was that Iran had attacked the financial sector. And what they were doing was a so-called distributed denial of service attack. That is, what they would take is hundreds of thousands of compromised computers, so your personal computer at home. Unbeknownst to you, they'll hack into the computer. It'll continue to work most of the day normally. But once it's a member of the botnet, they can use what's called command and control, and a single individual can execute a command that tells those hundreds of thousands of computers to do something. And what they often do is they use that control to direct all of those computers to simultaneously ask for information from a site. The site gets too many requests for information at once and goes down. And so what we saw with Iran, who was mad about sanctions that the US had imposed, is what Iran did was they didn't attack the most protected part of our financial system. Instead, they went after the public-facing websites of banks, the ones you use as a customer. And they used one of these, they're called denial of service attacks, or in this case, a distributed denial of service attack, to put all that firepower at those public-facing sites. They knocked the sites down, and it affected hundreds of thousands of customers and cost tens of millions of dollars. In the beginning, we didn't do a good job. We still were in the secret mode where we knew that it was happening and we didn't do a good job of sharing it with the banks. And as time went, we got better at this new approach of trying to share with them, hey, we know there's a breakdown in the negotiations with Iran. You're likely to see one of these denial of service attacks. That would allow them to go purchase more broadband, more capacity so that they could withstand one of those attacks and be prepared for it. And we also started tracking who did it. And we figured out, just like we have with the PLA, by name and by face, exactly who did it. And as we were investigating it, we discovered, well, they didn't just use this distributed denial of service attack. These individuals linked to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had also done things like they hacked into the Bowman Dam in Rye, New York, and accessed its sluice control system. So that means they were remotely able to open and close the dam and cause flooding. Now, as it so happens, the Bowman Dam was not working. It was down for physical maintenance. But I think you'll agree with me that our first line of cyber defense should not be crumbling physical infrastructure. So I didn't take that as necessarily as a sign of success. We brought that case ultimately criminally as well. Now, when the intelligence community describes what are our top nation-state adversaries, they always name 4 countries, and it's still true today, that the top 4 adversaries are Iran, and we talked about the case that we brought, China, and North Korea, and Russia. So we had used this new approach of figuring out who did it, making it public, and imposing consequences against 3 of the big 4 heading into the 2016 election. And when it comes to the election, we didn't do enough fast enough. And in fact, that new executive order that President Obama signed wasn't used. The first time it was used was not until December of 2016, and the first time it was used was against the Russians. I'll go back to a little bit about that, but one side note. In between, President Obama and President Xi had a summit. And prior to the summit, we'd seen a massive hack of federal records by China into the Office of Personnel Management. Stole almost every federal employee's record, family records, and in fact, the first piece of mail that my daughter got, she was very excited to see her name on the top of an envelope, but the first piece of mail that she got was a notice saying that her identity had been stolen by the OPM. That hack, plus the public case we'd already brought and leading into a summit, right before the presidents were going to have a summit, the Washington Post printed an article that said we were about to use that executive order to sanction the companies that were receiving stolen information in China. And we got a call from the personal emissary of President Xi saying that he would like to come over with a delegation. So they came over at the last minute. They had a lot more people than we did, 40-something people. We had to go find a hotel room, actually, to conduct the negotiations. They're about 3 days and nights. And what we hammered out during that agreement was, for the first time, a principle, a norm to set the rules of the road that said it is not okay to use your military and intelligence to target private companies for private commercial gain. And President Xi got up and announced that. And after he announced that with President Obama, the G20, so all the largest industrial countries, followed on and signed up to that same norm. I think that's a sign of how progress can be made if we stick to an approach that says we are going to continue to raise the cost of this type of behavior until you change it. And particularly with China, what they were doing is theft, and ultimately it's a cost-benefit analysis. And if we can have the determination, not just in the United States, but working with our like-minded allies throughout the world to set some of these norms or rules, that we can change behavior. With Russia, I think they took the opposite lesson from interfering in our 2016 election. They saw it succeed. And I think the sanctions that came in at the end of 2016 were too little, too late to convince them that it hadn't worked at undermining people's confidence in democracy in the United States. And President Putin, I believe, views democracy as an existential threat to his regime. So he attacks it not just in the United States, but all throughout the world. He's trying to cause mischief in democratic elections. And partly what we need to continue to do is make public that which we're seeing them do, sharing it so people can think about it and try to figure out how to protect themselves. And sometimes the protection is not great cyber skills. There is no internet-connected computer that's safe from a dedicated adversary these days, from a nation state or an organized criminal group, if they really want to get in. The technology doesn't exist in government or the private sector. But if you know that they're coming in, and change your mentality and start thinking about what's it going to be like when they get in, there are steps you can take. After our election, President Macron was running to be president of France, and he knew the Russians were not rooting for his campaign, and he was expecting them to come in. And so what they did is they waited, and sure enough, Russia hacked into their campaign. They stole email from the system, same playbook, and they tried to dump it out to affect the election. But in that case, when they tried to dump it, President Macron's campaign pointed out, we put false emails into our system. So some of the emails that you have are real campaign and some are not. We made them up, expecting this to happen. And we're not going to tell you which is which. And so the media didn't know what to run, ultimately, and it took the sting out of the campaign. So low cost, no high technology, but it took the legs out of an attack. Or another idea would be, if you start from the assumption that they can get into your system, no matter how good your defenses are, it is not a good idea to have a folder with your crown jewels in it called crown jewels, right? Bad idea. That doesn't mean you get rid of your crown jewels folder, though. It means maybe you keep it, but you put stuff in there that's not going to work or that's not real information, and you watch and wait as the adversary goes to steal it. If you're a company, you monitor what they're doing, get a sense of what they're up to on your system. But if they don't have an insider, they don't know where the real information is on what are often complex networks. It's another low-cost way to raise the cost for the adversary overseas to make your system safer that starts from the assumption that the wall that we're building can't be high enough or deep enough to keep them out, so we need to start thinking about what's in there. I want to move to one last threat, which is that of organized crime. I've talked about nation states, and we've talked a little bit about the blended threat. The Foerster case was the first time that we charged both criminal, so computer hacking, and terrorism in the same case. There was a blending of the threat that happens more in this space because once you steal information or create a tool, different folks can use it. Increasingly, there's a multi-billion-dollar, very successful back-end organized crime when it comes to computer theft. And when I say it's organized crime, I mean things like, if you know where to look on the dark web, that part of the internet that's not indexed, it doesn't show up if you do a Google search, but if you know the right IP address, you know where to go, you will see a website that looks a lot like Amazon, but Amazon for crooks. And when I say it looks like Amazon, I mean literally it'll have things like a criminal will put up, I've stolen 100,000 credit cards, and if you pay $100, you can get them. And it'll have a review that says, I've bought from this crook before, and he's real good, and 10% of them worked. And they actually use the same starring system. So at the end of it, it'll say 5 stars. And then the ones I like the best, it'll say, I bought from this crook, and he ripped me off. 1 star, he can't be trusted. I'm like, what did you expect? You're on Amazon for crooks. A real criminal case that we brought, in fact, the name of the group, it was called In Fraud, and their motto was, In Fraud We Trust. And it was like the mafia families that used to meet. These were all the major organized fraudsters, and they had set up a website where they could share best practices with each other. And it turns out you can't trust them because we were actually on the system, which is how we broke up the case. So sometimes you look at that and you think, well, this is this amorphous and unsolvable problem. There's so many of these crooks out there. How do we get in? How do we disrupt? I think increasingly the problem, the organized criminal problem is largely a Russia problem. It has to do with rogue states facing it. What Russia has done is they allow criminals to operate with impunity inside Russia, even if they're on every other country's most wanted list. And what they do is they allow them to operate, but they also task them for the intelligence community. I'll give one example, and this was one of the first individuals sanctioned under that new executive order. His name was Balan. And this was a guy who really was a crook. He did things like he took over the search engine for Yahoo, and if you did a search, he would redirect everyone to an erectile dysfunction site. And then he got a kickback from the site as if he was a really great advertiser. They thought he was driving legitimate traffic. So again, like the color white, not a national security issue, although it could be an issue. But in addition to doing that scam, he was a big spammer, and he was on our most wanted list at the FBI. And there's a unit in the FBI, in the Russian, the FSB, who we often would cooperate with on things like terrorism or crimes against children, issues that really were outside the political disputes between countries and where you could agree that that's bad. And we thought, well, this is traditional criminal activity, that's bad, is on the most wanted list, we'll ask for their help, their cooperation in arresting him. Not only did they not arrest him, the unit, the very unit that was assigned to be the cooperative unit with the FBI, signed him up as an intelligence asset. And so, not what we had in mind. And so he did things like he stole in the largest theft of email from Yahoo, hundreds of thousands of email address and related information about users. And then he was using that for a giant spam scheme. He just wanted to use it to spam people. But the intelligence agents who were running him used that same trove of information to get information that they used on the eve of their attacks and incursion into Ukraine. And they also used it to target FBI and other agents, government agents, to see if they could find embarrassing information that they could use to try to flip them in the cat and mouse games between intelligence agencies. That blend, that exploitation of criminals for purposes of the state is increasing. And there's been a couple other examples. Number one, you see, like that case, criminals who are used by the intelligence agency. But with Russia, who's increasingly a kleptocracy, so the government agents are corrupt as well. The government agents are using the best tools and tradecraft of the Russian intelligence agencies, but they're not doing it on behalf of the state. At night, they'll be using it just to make a buck on their own. And then lastly, what you see is certain tools are just indiscriminately applied by Russia. So one of the largest destructive cyber attacks was so-called NotPetya was the name. It was a ransom worm. So what it did was, there's something called ransomware. This is code that if it's unleashed on your computers, it locks up. So it encrypts everything on your computer or server. When you try to access it, you get a message that says, if you ever want to see your data again, you got to pay, X dollar, let's make it $500 again of Bitcoin. Otherwise, we won't decrypt it. And that's called ransomware, really prevalent. I'm seeing client after client get hit with it at major companies. And if it's a small enough amount and it's a big enough loss, people are paying. And that's why you keep seeing these schemes. Russia deployed a version of this against Ukraine called NotPetya. But it then ended up, and they were doing it to try to disrupt Ukraine, not to make the money. But it spread indiscriminately throughout the world. And so it hit companies like Maersk Pharmaceutical, and it cost them over $700 million worth of damages. It hit FedEx, cost FedEx $300 million worth of damages. It hit everything from law firms to hospitals. It was a cyber weapon of mass destruction that was unleashed, and ultimately, I think that with insufficient consequence to Russia. Like they did not pay the amount that they had imposed on others. It's that type of attack, I think, that we need to use, hopefully, to galvanize partnership with like-minded countries. In that case, we did do a simultaneous sanctions with multiple countries and throw out diplomats. But that track record needs to be applied continuously, and the pressure needs to be increased until the behavior changes, which it hasn't. Last, and before I open it up to questions, just on the big picture. When you think about it, over a 25, 30-year period, we've moved almost everything we value, from books and papers, from analog to digital, and then we connected it through a protocol, the protocol that governs the internet, that was fundamentally, and one of the things I did in the book was interview the coders who originally created the internet. It was never designed with security in mind. And yet it caused so many efficiencies that in business and in government, we rushed to put almost everything we value into that space without ever pricing and thinking about risks. And partly in government, we're to blame for that as well, because we didn't do a good enough job of sharing what those threats are, and that many things that you might think of as science fiction attacks have already occurred and hit companies and are hitting them regularly. And what I think you're starting to see now is in boardrooms, in government agencies, that they're saying, we need to start adequately pricing risk, we need to change some of our behaviors, and are starting to reckon with what it is that we've created. In the meantime, we move further and faster than any other country in the world, and we're more vulnerable when it comes in that space. Even though we have capability to cause attacks, no one else is as digitalized as fast as we have. That's where we are right now. But one of the reasons I'm so glad you came out and showed interest, even on a bit of a chilly night, in this topic is we're on the cusp of a revolution where, if you think about the change in our society that we went through in just one sector when we moved from a horse and buggy to a car with a driver. In that sector alone, we're about to move from a car with a driver to a driverless car, connected through the internet. This is the so-called Internet of Things. It's going to have huge consequences on our society as it moves through different sectors. Billions of new devices are being rolled out, sometimes designed with great security and safety on everything, and then at the very end, you add a chip. That's a 10-cent chip. That's what you're using to connect it to the internet, and not thinking about what the consequences are if you connect it to the internet. So your refrigerator, your baby monitor, your doorbell, they're all going to be connected to the internet. What we can't do, again, is roll that out without security in mind, without thinking through the risks on the front end, and then figure out what to do with it. And yet, that's exactly what we're currently doing. We've already had pacemakers literally put into people's hearts, internet connected, and then they realized, oh, we tested to see if it would work, but not if it would work if there was a crook or a terrorist or a spy who didn't want it to work. And it turns out an 11-year-old with publicly available software can hack and kill. Then they rolled out a patch. But I think you'll agree with me, and not to pick on Microsoft, but many people use Windows. You've probably had a few times your computer has frozen up, and it's one thing when it's your laptop at home, and it's another thing when it's your pacemaker. And this isn't an area where we can roll out the product, see how it works, and then try to fix it when we're starting to move into things. Another example is the largest recall of its kind, but 1.4 million Jeep Cherokees were called off the road after an enterprising reporter went with a computer hacker and showed that you could get in through the Bose entertainment system into the braking and steering system of the car and take over the car. And they decided, we didn't have a good authority at the time that dealt specifically with cyber to deal with that, so actually we used the same provision that you have in the regulations that allows you, if there's a safety defect, like the brakes aren't working or there's a problem with the tires, to just do the recall until they rolled out a system that was safer. And the automobile industry, I think, actually has taken that lesson and is starting to think about building in the security on the front end. But there's so many other sectors as we move towards the Internet of Things. In order for us to make a change, it's going to, I think, take demand signal from all of us, both in terms of what we buy, so the demand signal we send as consumers, but also to our elected representatives that say, we got to do better and faster when it comes both to sharing information on what the threat is, but also to incentivizing companies as we go through. And there'll be many huge advantages to moving towards the Internet of Things, but we can't do it again without adequately thinking through the risks and doing it safely in round one, not fixing it after the fact. So thank you again for coming out tonight, and also look forward to your questions. Yes, sir.
Any questions? Hold on a minute here. Hold on. Microphone. We're live streaming so they can hear you.
Fidelity, TD Ameritrade, JP Morgan Trust, where I would be planting Trojans and worms that would go into redundant systems that says, okay, 16 months from now, all this stuff is going to evaporate all the files. So all the wealth just disappears. So when you're used to getting a statement saying you got $1 million in your retirement plan, all of a sudden says, we don't even know who the hell you are. We have no record of having you, and it's just vaporized. And, to me, it's just like the exposure is just phenomenal. That says, and of course, you talk to the ballot on that. We got redundant systems and
Yeah. So the
John, could you repeat the question for the audience?
Yeah.
Thanks.
maybe not in its entirety. So luckily that wasn't picked up by Facebook Live, I guess, and so I'll keep out of the question the diabolical plot the questioner just gave to our adversaries, but I think it was a good one. But I think the gist of the question is, how do you come up with a deterrent scheme or keep safe critical systems like our financial system, not included in the question, but similar would be electric grid or other core functions for our society, when it's become so much easier for non-traditional actors to do destructive acts that are on the scope or scale of a nation state. And I think it's right that, so what we've seen right now is that countries like Russia and China have the capability, but are deterrable. So they may have actually gotten into systems, and I used an example that is public of the Iran in Bowman Dam, but things like that, where they're accessing physical control systems or SCADA systems inside systems, but they're not using the capability because traditional deterrence is more effective in that field. And I think there is concern that if you cross certain red lines, that there's going to be, we're not going to respond through cyber means, but we'll respond through kinetic means, through physical means, that there'll be a military response if people are killed because of a nation-state activity. But what about terrorist groups or those who are not deterred by that action? I'll give one example that shows that what you're saying is not hypothetical. I was talking about the Internet of Things. There was already a massive botnet, on a bigger scale than the ones I was talking about before. It's called the Mirai botnet. And it actually took down part of the backbone of the Internet. So it disrupted anything that was connected to the Internet for a period of time. And it hit part of the backbone that was affecting Canada and the US. And we thought it was a major national security incident at the time. And it turned out to be a young Canadian kid who was mad at a rival gaming group. They had like a gaming dispute. And he had created this massive botnet. And he was trying to use it just to attack the other gaming group. But because he had created code that hit the Internet of Things, so it was hitting things like baby monitors, et cetera, all these unprotected devices, it was so big that it actually, the Internet was unable to withstand the amount of traffic that went over it, and that's how it crashed the backbone of the Internet. One part of your question I can't answer, which is, we know terrorist groups have that intent. So going back to Al-Qaeda, Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda at the time in 2012, had called for cyber jihad, specifically against the financial institutions of the West. And we know that there are criminal groups that have the capability to cause great harm to those institutions along with nation states. And we know, as I was describing with that Amazon for crooks on the back end, that some of these tools, because they don't just sell credit cards, they do things now like rent botnets. So if you go on that site, it'll say, we have a botnet, it has X capacity, if we'll charge you a certain amount of dollars and you can rent it and use it for your purpose, which means you don't have to be a very good computer coder. Someone else already did the work. You just pay them and use it. What I don't know is why the terrorist groups with the intent, instead of trying to develop the capability on their own, aren't renting some of these tools that are increasingly available because nation state, former spies have put them up for rent on the dark web. But that day will come, and I think we are in a race against time. Certain sectors, the financial sector is one, have done a better job. I think of the Iranian attacks helped, along with the attack on JP Morgan, of the industry taking very seriously what the threat may be. And they've created something that's called the FSARC, but a resiliency capacity, where they've tried to think through what would be the biggest shock to the financial system. And then, because they have the money, because it's the financial sector, unlike some of the other critical sector, they've created a project to try to essentially, if you were to knock down the integrity of information for a period of time on trades, that they have the ARC, where the protected information would still reside, which is a good model, I think, possibly for other sectors to follow. But it is still a real threat of a shock to our system. And what I hope is by sharing some of the stories about what's happened in venues like these and writing the book is that we take the necessary action before we have the September 11th-like event, because we will, after the fact, take the action.
Just to expand, I guess the thing that would scare me is the fact that if everyone thought that, gee, my money didn't go, but it could go, The
It panics
reality
the
is, all
system.
of a sudden, you're going to gold, and the whole economy is disrupted. Because currency, goes out of existence, because the only thing I trust is metal.
I think that's exactly right in terms of the top threats. And what we call that in this field sometimes is the integrity of information threat. So it may not be that they're stealing the money or information, but if you were to affect, in this case, financial, but there are other sectors as well, if you were to no longer know that it was reliable because they randomly decided to increase some and decrease others, then you've affected the integrity of the information and the integrity and confidence and trust in the system. And that's what we need to protect and think about. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is about the size of the cyber warfare army. I've read reports that China has an army, cyber warfare, dedicated like 500,000 personnel. Is there any confirmation of that or any guesstimate of that? And also, I know the U.S. Army, I believe, has opened up a cyber warfare sector in Augusta, Georgia. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but I'm interested. What's the size of the army that we're talking about?
Yeah, it's good. So I don't have the numbers on China. In other areas, China will have more numbers in terms of personnel, but maybe not more ultimately capability or capacity to cause attacks. In the U.S., there's been a big push for cyber command, the idea that you have air, you have water, you have commands that are in different domains, and cyber is now a new domain. And so we need to start applying resources to figure out what we can do in that domain. And traditionally, a lot of that expertise resided in the National Security Agency, but that fundamentally is an intelligence agency. But this is a command to try to focus on offensive capacity. Right now, so I think that will continue, and rightly so. That said, some people ask me sometimes, well, aren't we pretty good on offense? And so why don't we attack back, and why doesn't that solve the problem? But the problem here is, as I was outlining, we moved faster and further than anyone else in this space, so we're more vulnerable in this space. And there's the old precept, you should attack where you are strong and your enemy is weak. So just because we get attacked through cyber means doesn't mean our deterrence response should be through cyber means. If you look at North Korea, you probably as an audience have more IP addresses, Internet Protocol addresses in this room than the entire nation state of North Korea had during the Sony attack. So if we knocked the whole country offline, it just wouldn't have as much of an impact as our sanctions do on their way of life. So I think we need to continually work to be as creative as we can on what's the package of actions we can take that'll cause most harm to whichever adversary is trying to attack us. Where we're weak right now, and I worry about this going into the 2020 election, is in order to deter, though, we need to be very clear that if you cross certain lines, you will get a responsive action. And I don't think we've sent the message clearly that says if we catch you meddling in the 2020 election, we will at a minimum do, for instance, sectoral sanctions and cut off your entire country from the economy. And if we don't do that, you can take those actions after the fact, but that's not deterrence. That's retaliation. So to have a credible deterrence strategy means coming up clearly ahead of time with actions that are scary enough that it deters adversaries.
Despite our efforts to be prepared, is it inevitable that as technology evolves, that the bad guys will always be one step ahead and always be probing the system to find some weak link that you possibly didn't think about?
I think it's inevitable if we don't innovate our way out of the issue. If we continue to use this protocol that's fundamentally insecure on these very complex systems, that's why if you're a dedicated, persistent adversary, you can get in, because most of the attacks I've seen, even some of the most successful and sophisticated attacks against companies that have invested a lot, are not because if everything worked perfectly, they wouldn't have caught it. It's because they're using known vulnerabilities, and someone somewhere screws up on an incredibly complex system that's relying on human behavior down the line. So I know I'm sounding somewhat pessimistic about where we are on cyber, and with good reason, because the alarm bell needs to be rung. But I am ultimately optimistic that we innovated our way into this problem, and it's relatively, it seems like forever, but it's relatively recent. I know most kids can. I mean, my daughter, when she was learning to read, tried to swipe the page to give a sense of how ubiquitous. But the iPhone hasn't been around that long, so if we have the will and we focus on the problem, and one of the things we're advocating through the Aspen Institute is a cyber moonshot and research and development towards it. We don't need to rely on this insecure system for everything. I mean, when it comes to our financial sector, our electric grid, or nuclear, or when we're connecting smart cities to things like cars, there may be a new technology that we use that isn't as good, possibly, as communicating or the speed, but is much, much safer, and it doesn't allow anonymity, which is at the core of the internet, which is what's allowing so many of these attacks to occur.
We have one more question for tonight.
Do we have the capacity, do we have the capacity, because a lot of the tech companies are US-based or international-based, to like shut down Russia's access to the internet for a week? You know, the first week of October, so they notice that attacking our election may not be.
Such a good idea. So there's capacity to cause disruption in Russian systems that are connected to the internet, no doubt, just like they have that capacity here. Could you deny Russian access to IP addresses in the US? Not the way we're currently configured, because you can use technology to obscure where it is that you're coming from, or you can hop from other countries into the United States. If you had a specific attack, you might be able to disrupt. I was talking about those denial of service attacks. That type of attack you might be able to figure out and disrupt on the back end where it's occurring. And part of the cyber command that they're developing is to see if they can develop that capacity. It raises some new issues, diplomatic and international issues, because the way the internet works, it's so interconnected, it's hard to have an attack where the effects of the attack are only in the nation that you're trying to attack. To make it effective or disrupt and follow some of these actors, they hop around the world and using different servers, so you end up, without permission, hitting friendly or allied countries. And so there's been some talk about, like a hot pursuit type of doctrine, or working out with like-minded countries. So there's an expectation that if what you're trying to do is, they call it defensive effects, offensive operation, but if what you're trying to do is disable an attack, that they'll permit that type of essentially hot pursuit that's disrupting other actors. So I think there's some hope there, and we need to do more on deterrence. Ultimately, there will still be some actors who are not deterrable, which is why we need to also keep focusing on developing safer devices in the first instance, so we're not as vulnerable in that space. I want to thank you again for having me tonight, and your interest in the subject and your questions.
Thank you. I think Joe, hold on, John. John, hold on. I think Joe has something for you here.
No, this was actually a giveaway to you, Brenneman, for being a member of Friends of Board and supporting us. We did a drawing for you. I think is what this was for. Yeah. Is Hugh here? There you go. Hi. Thank you, Judge, for coming.
So thank you for being here tonight. I have some bad news, and I have some good news. The bad news is the quilts are gone. The good news is cookies are back. So please enjoy, and thank you very much for coming tonight.